She walked into the trial in chains, she walked out with their heads. The palace of civilizational assessment drifted through space like a living museum designed by someone who had confused cultural sophistication with architectural narcissism. The massive bioship pulsed with organic rhythms, its hull a tapestry of living art that supposedly represented the pinnacle of galactic aesthetic achievement. Crystalline observation domes sprouted from its surface like jeweled tumors, each one showcasing the refined cultural artifacts of the 6 species who had appointed themselves the arbiters of civilizational worth. The Cultural Hierarchy Council had convinced themselves they were the galaxy's foremost authorities on what constituted proper civilization, which was roughly equivalent to a committee of art critics declaring themselves qualified to determine which planets deserved to continue existing. Each member represented what they considered the absolute peak of cultural evolution, though their definition of culture seemed to have some interesting gaps around concepts like diversity, tolerance, and not systematically erasing other people's histories. The main assessment chamber resembled what might happen if someone crossed an art gallery with a courtroom and then asked a team of pretentious curators to handle the interior decorating. Holographic displays showed the evolutionary progression of various species, from barbarism to enlightenment, with the council members' own cultures representing the theoretical endpoint of all civilizational development. The lighting had been calibrated to make everything look either primitively crude or sophisticatedly refined, depending on which narrative the council wanted to support. At the center of this monument to cultural arrogance, suspended in an energy field that allegedly preserved her primitive essence for study, hung Dr. Iris Kaine, formerly of Earth's Institute for Comparative Cultural Studies, currently of nowhere in particular thanks to some rather creative interpretations of anthropological ethics. The containment matrix wasn't just for show. Each energy strand had been programmed to suppress what the council termed cultural contamination vectors, which translated roughly to ideas that might make people question authority. The subject will acknowledge the supreme cultural authority of the Cultural Hierarchy Council and submit to our assessment of her species' civilizational status, announced Prime Cultural Arbiter Velthorn of the Thelnari Purist movement, his voice carrying the sort of academic pomposity that suggested he had confused educational credentials with moral authority. His species resembled what might happen if someone crossed a peacock with a philosophy professor and then taught the result about cultural superiority. Iris looked up with the expression of someone who had just discovered that her morning coffee had been replaced with liquid condescension. "Oh, I acknowledge your authority. Hard to miss something this aggressively self-congratulatory." And the arbiter's ornate plumage ruffled with what might have been cultural indignation. "You stand accused of cultural contamination in the first degree, primitive influence propagation, and 29 counts of barbaric concept distribution." He paused for what was presumably dramatic effect, though it came across more like a lecturer waiting for applause that never came. "How do you answer these charges before the Supreme Tribunal of Galactic Civilization?" "I'm suspended in an energy field, actually. But please, continue with whatever this anthropological theater is supposed to be." The first witness approached the testimony platform with all the dignity of a being who had never been informed that dignity and cultural imperialism were mutually exclusive concepts. Cultural refinement specialist Nixthara of the Thelnari represented a species that had perfected the art of civilizational improvement. They didn't destroy other cultures so much as provide sophisticated alternatives to species that were clearly too primitive to appreciate proper refinement. "The subject," Nixthara began, her elaborate costume rustling with the sound of fabric that cost more than most planets' annual budgets, "systematically undermined our lawful cultural elevation programs in the Centauri cultural zone. Our methodology follows established anthropological principles in identifying primitive practices and replacing them with sophisticated alternatives." "Define sophisticated alternatives," requested High Eth Bexmarin of the aristocratic Baloth refinement circle, whose species looked like someone had decided that regular nobility wasn't pretentious enough and needed more jewels grafted directly onto their skeletal structure. We identify cultural practices that demonstrate primitive thinking patterns and provide superior replacements that align with proper civilizational standards, Nixara explained, with the sort of clinical detachment usually reserved for discussing the removal of diseased tissue. This includes the systematic replacement of chaotic artistic expressions with harmonious alternatives, the substitution of primitive belief systems with rational philosophical frameworks, and the conversion of inefficient social structures into optimized hierarchical organizations. How culturally enlightened, Iris murmured. And what happened when I interfered with this cultural miracle? You introduced what you called cultural relativism to our refinement subjects, Nixara replied, her ornate headdress quivering with remembered academic trauma. Our entire Centauri operation was disrupted when the target populations began questioning whether their traditional practices were actually inferior to our improvements. Some even suggested that cultural diversity might have inherent value beyond our measurement standards. The barbarity, Iris said dryly. People thinking their own cultures might be worth preserving. How primitively disruptive. Next came Social Elevation Director Grixwald of the Baloth Refinement Circle, whose species resembled what might happen if someone crossed an art dealer with a genetic engineer, and then taught the result about class warfare. The Baloth specialized in aristocratic integration, essentially forcibly adopting promising individuals from primitive cultures, while discarding the rest as genetically unsuitable for refinement. The human demonstrated complete disregard for established elevation protocols, Grixwald stated, her voice carrying the particular tone of wounded nobility that suggested someone had questioned her breeding. When we began standard cultural adoption procedures on the vegan colonies, she sabotaged our selection processes with what can only be described as democratically subversive concepts. Elaborate on this democratic subversion, directed Prime Arbiter Velthorn, leaning forward with the sort of professional interest usually reserved for particularly exotic forms of cultural decay. She convinced our adoption candidates that they had the right to refuse cultural elevation, Grixwald replied, her jeweled exoskeleton clicking with distress. Our entire processing facility ground to a halt when potential adoptees began demanding to remain with their birth cultures instead of accepting integration into superior social structures. We lost thousands of promising specimens to voluntary primitivism. Plus, she introduced the concept of cultural consent to our subject populations, added genetic curator Tilvas, whose crystalline implants were flickering with agitation. Suddenly, entire bloodlines wanted to know whether they actually wanted their genetic profiles optimized for aristocratic compatibility. It completely disrupted our improvement workflow. The parade of wounded cultural dignity continued with increasing anthropological absurdity. The artistic Vixtaran complained about their aesthetic standardization programs being disrupted by the strategic introduction of what they termed chaotic creativity principles. The philosophical Quendari were still processing the trauma of having their intellectual restructuring operations sabotaged by the revolutionary concept that multiple valid perspectives might exist simultaneously. Each species described their methods with the sort of academic precision that made cultural genocide sound like peer-reviewed research. The Murthek detailed their expertise in linguistic purification through vocabulary optimization, systematically replacing complex native languages with simplified communication systems that were easier to control. The Zilneth explained their mastery of historical revision for psychological wellness, essentially rewriting entire species' past to eliminate inconvenient memories of independence or cultural achievement. All very scholarly, all very scientifically justified, all very much indistinguishable from systematic cultural extermination once you stripped away the academic jargon and anthropological terminology. Iris's court-assigned cultural liaison, a trembling Yelvani named Dex Mira, whose chromatophore patches kept shifting colors with her anxiety, presented what could charitably be called a cultural defense. Her primary strategy seemed to involve apologizing profusely for human primitiveness, while arguing that pre-civilized species couldn't be held responsible for their naturally barbaric tendencies. The prosecution has demonstrated clear evidence of systematic cultural contamination, announced Chief Cultural Prosecutor Tulnex of the Quendari Philosophical Hegemony. a being who resembled what might happen if someone crossed a university dean with a particularly vindictive encyclopedia. The subject has shown a pattern of primitive influence propagation across 43 different cultural zones. The Cultural Hierarchy Council will now deliberate on appropriate civilizational remediation, declared Prime Arbiter Velthorn, his elaborate plumage shifting to colors that probably indicated anticipatory satisfaction. Given the severity of the crimes against cultural advancement, we are considering comprehensive cultural restructuring to eliminate barbaric influence vectors. Translation: they want to lobotomize my cultural knowledge and turn me into a compliant example of proper refinement, Iris said conversationally. How very anthropologically progressive. Do you have any final words before we proceed with your cultural elevation? Asked the Prime Arbiter, his tone carrying all the mock solemnity of someone about to deliver a lecture they'd been rehearsing in faculty lounges. Iris looked around the chamber, her gaze lingering on each member of the Cultural Hierarchy Council in turn. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the sort of calm authority that made genuine scholars reconsider their assumptions and cultural supremacists wonder why the room had suddenly gotten more intellectually honest. Oh, I have words. Comprehensive, historically documented, anthropologically devastating words. She straightened as much as the containment field allowed, which was precisely enough to be academically imposing. But first, let me thank you all for such a thorough and meticulously recorded demonstration of cultural hypocrisy. The Cultural Hierarchy Council exchanged what might have been confused scholarly looks, though it was difficult to tell with species that communicated through chromatic displays, harmonic vibrations, and interpretive plumage arrangements. Hypocrisy, Velthorn's voice carried a note of uncertainty that suggested his cultural translation matrix was having difficulty processing the concept. Cultural refinement specialist Nixthara, thank you for that detailed explanation of how your species systematically commits cultural genocide while calling it sophistication improvement. Social Elevation Director Grixwald, your description of forced cultural adoption was particularly illuminating, especially since it directly contradicts your own species' foundational myth about the sacred nature of cultural diversity. The chamber began to fill with the sort of uncomfortable silence that usually preceded either profound anthropological revelations or spectacular academic scandals. Chief Prosecutor Toolnex, the Quendari practice of intellectual restructuring, that would be a direct violation of your own philosophical principle that truth emerges through the free exchange of diverse ideas, correct? And Hyesthetebex Miran, your aesthetic standardization programs seem to ignore your species' legendary commitment to the preservation of artistic heritage. Each named being began to exhibit their species' equivalent of scholarly panic. Chromatic displays flickered uncertainly, harmonic resonances shifted to discordant frequencies, and several organic forms began to secrete what might have been stress pheromones or liquid embarrassment. You see, here's the fascinating thing about this little cultural tribunal, Iris continued, her voice taking on the sort of pleasant tone that made experienced anthropologists start double-checking their research notes. I've spent the last 12 years studying comparative cultural history, including the actual historical records of every single one of your species. The implications began to sink in like a black hole settling into a comfortable orbit around an anthropological textbook. Every single one of your refined cultures was built on exactly the same barbaric foundations you now condemn in others. The Felnari cultural sophistication emerged from a period of systematic conquest and cultural assimilation that lasted for centuries. The Baloth aristocratic refinement was established through the enslavement and genetic manipulation of 12 different species. The chamber's communication systems suddenly erupted with incoming transmissions as authoritative voices from across the galaxy began demanding historical clarification and cultural accountability. But here's the really interesting part, Iris added, her smile somehow managing to convey both academic satisfaction and profound disappointment in her colleagues. Those anthropological research networks I've been using to broadcast your proceedings, they weren't just sending your confessions to random academics, They were transmitting directly to historians, archaeologists, and cultural preservation specialists throughout your own territories. The containment field around her flickered and died, as legitimate override codes activated from cultural research institutions across 6 different star systems. Dr. Iris Kaine, Earth Institute for Comparative Cultural Studies, consulting for the Galactic Anthropological Ethics Committee, she announced, producing credentials that materialized from what appeared to be a disguised research tablet. And I believe your own people are about to learn some very interesting things about their supposedly refined histories. The chamber's displays suddenly blazed with archival footage, archaeological evidence, and historical documents that painted a very different picture of the council members' cultural origins. Voices in dozens of languages began to echo through the chamber as suppressed historical records were broadcast to populations who had been taught sanitized versions of their own past. "Attention, cultural supremacists," announced a voice that carried the weight of actual academic authority. "This is Dr. Zexthala of the Independent Historical Research Coalition. We have received comprehensive evidence of systematic historical revisionism and cultural suppression. You will cease all unauthorized cultural modification operations immediately." Similar announcements echoed from legitimate anthropological institutions, as scholars representing dozens of oppressed cultures demanded the immediate restoration of suppressed historical records and cultural practices. The Galactic Council for Cultural Preservation thanks the Cultural Hierarchy Council for their detailed confessions to multiple counts of cultural genocide, historical revisionism, anthropological fraud, and really poor understanding of their own cultural origins, announced an authority whose credentials made the false tribunal's academic pretensions simply evaporate under scrutiny. As actual academic restraint fields began forming around the cultural supremacists, Iris walked toward the chamber's exit, which had suddenly become much more intellectually honest in its architectural design. She paused at the threshold, looking back at the beings who had minutes before been preparing to perform unauthorized cultural surgery on an anthropologist. "You know what the best part is? I didn't even have to lie or fabricate evidence. Your own historical records contain everything needed to expose your cultural supremacist mythology." She shook her head with genuine academic disappointment. "You've been committing cultural genocide while claiming to preserve civilization, all because you forgot, or chose to forget, your own barbaric origins." She stepped through the doorway, then turned back for one final anthropological observation. "That's the difference between real cultural sophistication and whatever this was supposed to be. Real civilization doesn't require the systematic destruction of other cultures to validate itself. Real sophistication comes from understanding and appreciating diversity, not from homogenizing it out of existence." 15 months later, the Palace of Civilizational Assessment continued to drift through space, though now it served as a genuine multicultural exchange center under the oversight of legitimate anthropological institutions. The facility operated according to principles that seemed revolutionary after centuries of the Cultural Hierarchy Council's rule: actual cultural preservation, authentic historical research, and the radical concept that civilization was enhanced by diversity rather than threatened by it. Iris Kaine currently served as Director of Cultural Preservation and Anti-Supremacy Studies, a position that mostly involved traveling the galaxy and explaining to various self-appointed cultural authorities why their sophisticated justifications for cultural genocide weren't as academically sound as they believed. The job came with excellent research benefits and the deep satisfaction of watching cultural supremacists discover that the universe had anthropological standards after all.